March 27, 1942. On a humble farm outside Muscle Shoals, Alabama, Harold Whitaker wiped the sweat from his brow as he mixed his latest batch of homemade fertilizer. The 46-year-old farmer believed he had finally perfected a formula that would help his crops withstand the devastating drought that meteorologists predicted for the coming summer. Little did he know that within 6 months, his peculiar blend of chemicals would catch the attention of the United States military and fundamentally alter the course of American munitions production for the remainder of World War II. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the remarkable tale of how one man's agricultural innovation, born from necessity and ingenuity, became the foundation for one of America's most closely guarded wartime secrets, transforming not only military capabilities, but also the very life of the unassuming farmer who created it. Harold Whitaker had not always been a farmer. In his younger years, he had studied chemistry at Auburn University, but abandoned his education after 3 years when his father passed away unexpectedly in 1918. Returning to the family farm, Harold applied his scientific knowledge to agriculture, keeping detailed notebooks about soil composition, crop yields, and fertilizer formulations. His neighbors often regarded his meticulous approach with amusement, referring to him as Professor Dirt behind his back. Science isn't just for laboratories, Harold would tell his wife Martha whenever she questioned the hours he spent in his makeshift shed laboratory. The soil is the greatest laboratory of all, and nature has been running experiments for millions of years. I'm just trying to pay attention to the results. Martha would typically respond with a patient smile. As long as your experiments keep food on our table, you can play scientist all you want. The Whitaker farm had managed to weather the Great Depression better than most in the region, largely due to Harold's innovative farming techniques and his uncanny ability to coax impressive yields from otherwise mediocre soil. Their relative prosperity, however, did little to protect them from the drought conditions that were becoming increasingly common in the southeastern United States. By early 1942, with America now fully engaged in World War II, farmers across the country faced dual pressures, producing enough food for both domestic consumption and to support the Allied war effort, all while coping with rationing of fuel, equipment, and even commercial fertilizers, many of which contained materials now deemed essential for munitions production. Captain James Thornton of the United States Army Ordnance Department sat at his desk in Washington, D.C., reviewing reports of munitions production figures. As the officer responsible for coordinating explosives research and development, Thornton faced an increasingly troubling reality. American forces were consuming ammunition at rates that threatened to outpace production capabilities, particularly for certain specialized explosives used in aerial bombs. "Sir, have you seen these projections?" Lieutenant Wilson asked, placing a folder on Thornton's desk. "At current rates, we'll have a 15% shortfall in ammonium picrate production by October. Ammonium picrate, also known by its military designation Explosive D, was particularly valued for armor-piercing shells due to its remarkable stability and power. Unlike more volatile explosives, it could penetrate armor before detonating, making it ideal for naval warfare against heavily armored Japanese vessels. The problem, however, was that its production required specific chemical precursors that were becoming increasingly difficult to source. "I've seen them," Thornton replied grimly. "What are our options?" "The chemical core suggests we could reallocate production capacity from other explosives, but that creates shortages elsewhere," Wilson explained. "Or we pursue alternative formulations, but testing and approval cycles would take months we don't have." Thornton rubbed his temples. "What about the agricultural division? Weren't they working on alternative sources for some of these compounds?" "Yes, sir. They've been collaborating with agricultural extension offices, but nothing promising has emerged yet." Neither officer could have anticipated that the solution to their problem was being mixed in a weathered shed in rural Alabama. That very moment, Harold Whitaker's fertilizer experiments had recently taken an interesting turn. Frustrated by the increasing scarcity of commercial fertilizers, he had begun experimenting with alternative sources of nitrogen and phosphorus. His training in chemistry, though incomplete, provided him with a fundamental understanding of the elements plants needed to thrive. "The problem isn't that the elements don't exist," he explained to his 16-year-old son Thomas, who had begun to show interest in his father's work. It's finding them in forms that plants can readily use. Among Harold's innovations was a method of extracting and concentrating nitrogen compounds from organic waste through a series of chemical reactions performed with simple farm equipment and readily available materials. What made his approach unusual was the addition of certain mineral compounds that, according to his notebooks, catalyzed the conversion process and stabilized the resulting mixture. One afternoon in late March, as Harold was mixing a new batch of his experimental fertilizer, he noticed something unusual. The mixture, which typically remained cool throughout the process, had begun to warm noticeably. "That's strange," he muttered, reaching for his thermometer. The mixture continued to heat, eventually becoming hot enough that Harold stepped back with concern. "Thomas," he called out, "bring me that bucket of water." His son rushed over with the water, which Harold carefully added to the mixture, slowing the reaction. Once the mixture had cooled, Harold collected a sample in a glass jar and held it up to the light, examining its crystalline structure. "I don't understand," he said. The proportions were the same as last time. What Harold didn't realize was that one of his ingredients, a mineral supplement he had purchased from a new supplier, contained significantly higher concentrations of certain compounds than his previous source. This seemingly minor variation had fundamentally altered the chemistry of his fertilizer. The next day, Harold applied his new fertilizer blend to a test plot of corn. The results over the following weeks were remarkable. The treated corn grew noticeably faster and appeared healthier than corn in adjacent plots treated with his standard mixtures. Encouraged, Harold began to scale up production of the new formula, keeping careful notes on its composition and effects. Dr. Eleanor Simmons of the Department of Agriculture's Research Service had been assigned an unusual task in April 1942. As part of the war effort, agricultural scientists across the country were being asked to identify innovative farming practices that might help maximize production despite resource limitations. "We're looking for the unorthodox, the unexpected," her supervisor had explained. "Farmers are practical problem solvers by nature. Someone out there might have already figured out solutions we haven't even considered." Dr. Simmons's assignment brought her to Alabama, where county agricultural extension agents had identified several farms demonstrating unusual productivity, despite the challenging conditions. The Whitaker farm was third on her list of visits. "Mr. Whitaker, your corn yields are quite impressive," Dr. Simmons noted, as Harold showed her around his property, "particularly given the weather conditions this season." Harold nodded modestly. "Been experimenting with some new fertilizer formulations. Seems to be helping the plants withstand the dry spell better than expected." "Mind if I ask about your methods?" Dr. Simmons inquired, notebook in hand. Harold hesitated only briefly before leading her to his shed. While typically private about his experiments, the idea that his work might help the national war effort appealed to his patriotic sensibilities. Over the next 2 hours, Harold explained his approach in detail, showing Dr. Simmons his notebooks and the various components of his fertilizer blend. Her interest grew noticeably when he mentioned the unexpected heating reaction he had observed. "And you've noticed no negative effects on the soil or plants?" she asked. "None at all," Harold replied. "If anything, this batch seems more effective than my previous formulations." Dr. Simmons collected samples of both the fertilizer and soil from treated areas. "Would you mind if our laboratories analyze these? Your approach is quite innovative. It might have applications beyond your farm." Harold agreed readily, pleased that his work was being taken seriously. "Happy to help however I can. Times like these, we all need to contribute what we can to the effort." What neither of them realized was that Dr. Simmons's analysis would soon find its way to desks far removed from agricultural research. 2 weeks later, in a government laboratory in Maryland, chemist Dr. Robert Keller stared at the analysis results from the Whitaker farm samples with growing excitement. "This can't be right," he said to his colleague, Dr. Maria Vasquez. "Run the tests again." Dr. Vasquez raised an eyebrow. "I already did, twice." The analysis had revealed something unexpected. Harold Whitaker's fertilizer contained compounds that bore striking similarities to certain explosives precursors, more specifically, with relatively minor processing. The material could be converted into a compound remarkably similar to ammonium picrate. And this farmer created this unintentionally? Dr. Keller asked. Apparently so, Dr. Vasquez confirmed. He was trying to make fertilizer from readily available materials. Dr. Keller reached for the telephone. I need to contact the Ordnance Department immediately. 3 days later, Captain James Thornton and Lieutenant Wilson found themselves on a military transport plane bound for Alabama, accompanied by Dr. Keller. Their mission, classified at the highest levels, was to assess whether Harold Whitaker's accidental discovery might offer a solution to their explosives production challenges. Just to be clear, Lieutenant Wilson said as their car approached the Whitaker farm, our objective is to determine if this fertilizer can be adapted for explosive D production, and if so, to secure both the formula and the farmer's cooperation. Correct, Captain Thornton replied, but remember, this is strictly preliminary. We don't want to alarm the man or create local speculation. As far as anyone needs to know, we're agricultural specialists following up on Dr. Simmons's visit. When the 3 men arrived at the Whitaker farm, Harold was initially surprised by their presence but welcomed them warmly. Captain Thornton, dressed in civilian clothes, introduced himself as James Thornton from the Department of Agriculture, deliberately omitting his military rank. Dr. Simmons was quite impressed with your fertilizer formulation, Mr. Whitaker, Thornton explained. She thought it warranted further investigation. Harold's chest swelled with pride. Happy to show you gentlemen around. Not often a simple farmer gets government visitors. As Harold led them through his operation, explaining his processes and showing them his test plots, Dr. Keller asked increasingly specific questions about chemical proportions and reaction conditions. Though somewhat puzzled by the technical nature of the inquiries, Harold answered thoroughly, occasionally consulting his notebooks for precise details. Mr. Whitaker, have you ever noticed any unusual properties in your fertilizer? Dr. Keller asked carefully. Beyond its effectiveness on plants, I mean. Harold thought for a moment. Well, there was that heating reaction I mentioned to Dr. Simmons, and once, when I dropped a metal tool into a fresh batch, it seemed to spark a bit. Figured it was just some kind of chemical reaction with the metal. The 3 visitors exchanged meaningful glances. Mr. Whitaker, Captain Thornton said finally, I think it's time we were completely honest with you about the nature of our visit. Over coffee at the Whitaker kitchen table, with Martha and Thomas present at Harold's insistence, Captain Thornton revealed his true identity and explained the potential military significance of Harold's fertilizer formula. Based on preliminary analysis, we believe that with some modification, your formulation could help address critical shortages in certain materials. Essential to the war effort, Thornton explained cautiously. You mean for growing more food? Martha asked. Not exactly, ma'am, Lieutenant Wilson replied. For munitions production. Harold's cup froze halfway to his lips. Munitions? You mean my fertilizer could be used to make bombs? In essence, yes, Dr. Keller confirmed. Your mixture contains chemical precursors that could be converted into components of high explosives, specifically a type called ammonium picrate, or explosive D as it's known militarily. Harold set his cup down slowly. I was just trying to help things grow. And now you have the opportunity to help in an even more significant way, Captain Thornton said earnestly. Mr. Whitaker, your country needs innovations like yours. With refinement, your formula could help ensure our forces have the ammunition they need to prevail. Thomas, who had been listening intently, spoke up. Pa, this could be important. Real important. Harold looked at his son, then at his wife, whose expression revealed both concern and pride. What exactly would you need from me? Harold asked finally. Your complete formula and production methods for a start, Dr. Keller replied, and ideally your expertise during the refinement process. The government would compensate you, of course. Captain Thornton leaned forward. Mr. Whitaker, I must emphasize the classified nature of this matter. Should you agree to assist us, you would not be able to discuss your work with anyone outside approved personnel. Harold nodded slowly. I understand. Let me discuss this with my family tonight. You'll have my answer in the morning. That evening, after the government representatives had departed for their hotel in town, the Whitaker family held a serious discussion around the dinner table. It's not what I intended my work for, Harold admitted. I wanted to feed people, not... He trailed off, unable to complete the thought. But you'd be helping protect our boys overseas, Martha pointed out. Tommy Grayson from down the road is in the Pacific right now. So is Betty Williams' eldest. Thomas nodded. And my friends are talking about enlisting as soon as they're old enough. Harold looked at his son with sudden concern. You're not thinking of... I'm 16, Pa, Thomas replied. In another year I could go. The reality of that possibility hung heavily in the room. If what you've created can help end this war sooner, Martha said softly, how can we not share it? Harold nodded, reaching a decision. We'll help. But I want assurances that after the war, my work can return to its original purpose, helping things grow, not destroying them. The next morning, Harold informed Captain Thornton of his decision. Within days, he found himself bound for a classified facility outside Baltimore, Maryland, leaving Martha and Thomas to manage the farm with the help of Harold's brother, who had been quietly briefed that Harold was doing important agricultural research for the government. The Ballistics Research Laboratory at Aberdeen Proving Ground was unlike anything Harold had ever experienced. Surrounded by scientists with advanced degrees and military personnel with high security clearances, the Alabama farmer initially felt profoundly out of place. Dr. Eleanor Simmons, who had been transferred to the project due to her agricultural expertise and familiarity with Harold's work, helped ease his transition. Remember, Mr. Whitaker, these people may know theory, but you're the one who actually created the formula, she reminded him. Your practical knowledge is invaluable here. Over the following weeks, Harold worked closely with a team of chemists and explosives specialists to refine his fertilizer formula for military applications. The process involved isolating specific components, modifying others, and establishing production methods that could be scaled for industrial manufacturing. Colonel Frederick Dennison, who oversaw the project, was initially skeptical about the involvement of a civilian farmer with no formal scientific credentials. However, Harold's intuitive understanding of chemical interactions and his ability to solve practical problems quickly earned the colonel's respect. Whitaker, you've got a natural gift for this work, Colonel Dennison remarked one evening as they reviewed progress reports. Ever consider what you might have accomplished if you'd finished that chemistry degree? Harold shrugged. Life takes the turns it takes, Colonel. No use wondering about roads not traveled. By June 1942, laboratory tests had confirmed the viability of the modified Whitaker formula, which had been officially designated Compound W. Initial small-scale production yielded an explosive material that demonstrated remarkable stability and effectiveness. The next phase would involve field testing at the Proving Grounds range facilities. On a warm morning in late June, Harold stood with Colonel Dennison, Captain Thornton, and several scientists behind a protective barrier as technicians prepared the first field test of Compound W. The target is an armor plate of similar specifications to that used in Japanese warships, Colonel Dennison explained. Standard explosive D has proven effective against such armor, but production limitations have hampered deployment if your compound performs comparably. Harold nodded, understanding the implications. The success of his accidental discovery could significantly impact the war in the Pacific, where American forces were struggling against heavily armored Japanese naval vessels. A voice crackled over the loudspeaker. Range is clear. Detonation in 30 seconds. As the countdown proceeded, Harold felt a strange mixture of pride and unease. His life's work had been dedicated to nurturing growth, yet here he stood, about to witness the destructive potential of his creation. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The explosion was more powerful than Harold had anticipated. The armor plate, 3 inches thick and weighing several hundred pounds, was not merely damaged but completely shattered. When the smoke cleared, the testing team surveyed the results with evident satisfaction. Remarkable, Dr. Keller murmured, examining the fragmented remains of the armor. The penetration and subsequent detonation pattern is actually superior to standard explosive D in several respects. Colonel Dennison turned to Harold, his expression serious. Mr. Whitaker, I believe your country is about to owe you a considerable debt of gratitude. By August 1942, Preparations were underway for industrial-scale production of Compound W. An existing munitions facility in Tennessee was modified specifically for this purpose, with Harold consulting on equipment specifications and production processes. Meanwhile, in the Pacific Theater, American forces continued to face significant challenges against Japanese naval power. Vice Admiral William Halsey, commanding U.S. naval forces in the South Pacific, received a classified briefing about the new explosive compound being prepared for deployment. "And you're telling me this stuff was originally created by a farmer trying to grow better corn?" Admiral Halsey asked incredulously. "Yes, sir," replied Commander Phillips, the ordnance officer delivering the briefing. "But the refinements made for military application have been extensive. The technical specifications indicate it will provide approximately 20% greater effectiveness against armored targets than our current shells." Admiral Halsey studied the performance projections. "When can we expect delivery?" "First shipments are scheduled for deployment in October, sir. Initial quantities will be limited, so strategic allocation will be necessary." "Prioritize the destroyer squadrons engaging enemy surface vessels," Halsey ordered. "If this performs as indicated, it could substantially alter our tactical approach to naval engagements." While the military prepared to deploy weapons utilizing his innovation, Harold Whitaker continued his work at Aberdeen, refining the formula and production methods. His extended absence from home weighed on him, though he exchanged letters regularly with Martha and Thomas, carefully adhering to security protocols that prevented him from revealing the true nature of his work. In September, Harold received permission to return home for a brief visit. The farm appeared largely as he had left it, though he noted with a mixture of pride and melancholy that Thomas had stepped admirably into the role of managing daily operations. "You've done well here," Harold told his son, as they walked the fields together. "Had a good teacher," Thomas replied. "Though I haven't tried any crazy fertilizer experiments, figured one scientist in the family was enough." Harold laughed, though the reminder of his crazy fertilizer sobered him quickly. "Has anyone around here asked questions about where I've been?" Thomas shook his head. "Just like you and the government fellows arranged. Everyone thinks you're doing agricultural research. Even had a couple neighbors ask if they could try whatever new fertilizer you're developing when you get back." The irony was not lost on Harold. The community was eagerly awaiting an agricultural innovation that had been transformed into a weapon of war. That evening, sitting on the porch with Martha after Thomas had retired for the night, Harold finally gave voice to the thoughts that had troubled him for months. "I set out to feed people," he said quietly. "Now my work will be used to kill them." Martha took his hand. "You're helping to protect our boys, to end this war sooner." She paused. "And when it's over, you can go back to making things grow." Harold nodded, drawing comfort from her understanding. "Colonel Dennison has already spoken about post-war applications. Says with some modifications, the process could revolutionize certain aspects of agricultural chemistry. There, you see? Good can come from this even after the fighting stops." As Harold prepared to return to Maryland the following day, Thomas presented him with a small wooden box he had crafted. "For your notes," Thomas explained as Harold opened it. "Figured you should have something nice to keep them in, considering how important they've turned out to be." Harold embraced his son, emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "Take care of your mother and the farm. I'll be home as soon as I can." On October 12, 1942, the first shipment of artillery shells containing Compound W left the Tennessee production facility bound for the Pacific Theater. By this time, the formula had been further refined, and production efficiency had improved significantly under Harold's guidance. In recognition of his contributions, Harold received a civilian commendation from the Secretary of War, presented in a private ceremony attended by Colonel Dennison, Captain Thornton, and several other officers associated with the project. The citation, while deliberately vague about the specific nature of his work due to security concerns, acknowledged his exceptional contributions to the national defense effort. "Mr. Whitaker," Colonel Dennison said after the formal presentation, "I want you to know that the first deployment of your innovation will likely occur within weeks. The impact may well prove decisive in certain engagements." Harold nodded solemnly. "I hope it helps bring our boys home sooner, Colonel." On November 14, 1942, During a naval engagement near Guadalcanal, the destroyer USS O'Bannon encountered a Japanese cruiser at close range. Among the O'Bannon's armaments were several 5-inch shells equipped with the new Compound W explosive. When fired at the Japanese vessel, the shells demonstrated precisely the penetrating power and destructive capability that testing had predicted. Lieutenant Commander Wilkinson of the O'Bannon later reported, "The new ordnance performed beyond expectations. Direct hits resulted in penetration of enemy armor, followed by internal detonation, causing significantly greater damage than our standard shells. The engagement concluded with the enemy vessel disabled and subsequently sunk." Word of the new ammunition's effectiveness spread quickly among naval forces in the Pacific. Admiral Halsey, upon reviewing combat reports, immediately ordered increased allocation of Compound W shells to frontline vessels. In the Maryland laboratory, Harold received the news of the successful deployment with complicated emotions. On one hand, he felt pride that his work had protected American sailors. On the other, the reality that his creation had contributed to the deaths of Japanese sailors, men not unlike those he sought to protect, weighed heavily on his conscience. Dr. Simmons found him alone in the laboratory that evening, staring at a sample of the explosive compound. "Difficult news to process?" she asked gently. Harold nodded. "I keep reminding myself they'd have done the same to our boys if positions were reversed. But still, it's a credit to your humanity that you're troubled by it," Dr. Simmons offered. "The best among us never lose sight of the human cost, even when the cause is just." As 1942 drew to a close, production of Compound W continued to expand. New facilities were established in other locations, implementing the processes Harold had helped develop. Though his direct involvement gradually became less necessary as production was standardized, he remained an important consultant on the project. Throughout 1943, Compound W-equipped ordnance played an increasingly significant role in Pacific naval operations. Japanese naval intelligence noted the apparent change in American ammunition effectiveness, but failed to identify the specific innovation responsible. Captain Hiroshi Nakamura of Japanese Naval Intelligence compiled a report in June 1943, noting, "American naval shells now demonstrate alarming capabilities against our armored vessels. Initial impact damage appears minimal, but subsequent internal detonation causes catastrophic structural failure. Technical analysis suggests a new type of explosive with enhanced penetrating characteristics. Recommend immediate adaptation of armor designs and engagement tactics." By mid-1943, Harold was permitted to return to his farm on a more permanent basis, though he remained under obligation to consult periodically and maintain absolute secrecy about his work. His return to civilian life brought welcome relief, though the knowledge of his contribution to the war effort remained a complex emotional burden. Thomas, now 17, had continued to manage the farm effectively in his father's absence. Harold noted with pride that his son had even implemented some innovations of his own, including an improved irrigation system that conserved water while maintaining crop health. "You've become quite the farmer," Harold remarked as Thomas showed him the modifications he had made. "Had to step up with you gone," Thomas replied. "But I've been thinking about what comes next." Harold felt a tightening in his chest, anticipating his son's next words. "I've been accepted to Auburn," Thomas continued, "going to study agricultural science. Figure between your practical knowledge and some formal education, we might really have something special when I get back." The relief Harold felt was immense. Though he would never have prevented Thomas from enlisting had he chosen that path, the prospect of his son pursuing education rather than facing combat lifted a weight he hadn't fully acknowledged. "That's wonderful news," Harold said, "though I'm not sure how much my practical knowledge will help with your professor's assignments." Thomas grinned. "Don't sell yourself short, Pa. Not many fathers accidentally invent military explosives while trying to grow better corn." Throughout 1944, as Allied forces gained momentum across all theaters of war, production of Compound W continued at a steady pace. By this time, variations of the original formula had been developed for different applications. including specialized bombs for attacking hardened targets and bunkers. In April 1945, Harold received a letter from Captain Thornton, who had been promoted to Major. "Dear Mr. Whitaker, I thought you would want to know that your contribution continues to save American lives daily. Production efficiency has increased by 35% since initial deployment, and newer variants have proven effective against even the most hardened enemy positions. While security considerations prevent me from providing specific details, please know that your crazy fertilizer has become one of this war's most valued innovations. With sincere gratitude, Major James Thornton." As the war in Europe concluded in May 1945, Harold allowed himself to hope that the conflict in the Pacific might soon follow suit. The development of increasingly destructive weapons, including his own contribution, had created an unprecedented capacity for devastation, and he found himself praying that such power would soon become unnecessary. On August 6th and 9th, 1945, the world witnessed the deployment of atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The scale of destruction dwarfed anything previously conceived, including the effects of Compound W. Japan's surrender followed on August 15th. As news of the Japanese surrender reached the Whitaker farm, Harold sat on his porch, contemplating the strange journey that had taken him from Alabama soil to the secret laboratories of military research and back again. Martha joined him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "It's over," she said simply. Harold nodded. "Yes. Now we go back to growing things." In December 1945, Harold received an unexpected visit from Colonel Dennison, now General Dennison, accompanied by Dr. Keller and Dr. Simmons. "Mr. Whitaker," General Dennison began after they had settled in the Whitaker living room, "with the war concluded, certain aspects of your contribution can now be acknowledged more openly, at least within appropriate circles." "I've just been happy to return to farming," Harold replied. Dr. Keller smiled. "That's actually related to our visit. The process you developed has potential applications well beyond military use. With the appropriate modifications, it could indeed revolutionize certain aspects of agricultural chemistry, just as we discussed during the war." Dr. Simmons continued, "The government is establishing a research program focused on transitioning wartime innovations to civilian applications. We'd like you to participate as a consultant, particularly regarding agricultural applications of your work." Harold looked at Martha, who nodded encouragingly. "I'd be interested," Harold said cautiously, "but I have conditions. Whatever we develop must be accessible to ordinary farmers, not just large agricultural corporations, and I want to ensure it's used to help feed people, not for any purpose that could cause harm." General Dennison nodded. "Those terms are acceptable. We've actually prepared some initial documentation outlining the proposed program." As Harold reviewed the materials, he found himself experiencing a sense of completion. His accidental discovery, which had been diverted to purposes of war, now had the opportunity to fulfill its original intended purpose, helping things grow. In the years following the war, Harold divided his time between his farm and consulting work on what became known as the Agricultural Chemistry Advancement Program. The process he had developed was successfully adapted to create more efficient fertilizers that required fewer raw materials while providing improved results. By 1950, farms across America were benefiting from fertilizer formulations derived from Harold's original work, though few knew the unlikely wartime history of their development. The military applications of Compound W remained classified, with only those directly involved aware of the connection between the explosive and the humble Alabama farmer who had accidentally created it. Thomas completed his studies at Auburn with honors in 1949 and returned to join his father in managing the family farm, which had grown significantly through the acquisition of adjacent properties. The combination of Harold's practical innovations and Thomas's formal education proved remarkably effective, making Whitaker Farms one of the most productive agricultural operations in the region. In 1952, 10 years after his accidental discovery, Harold was invited to Washington, D.C. for a private ceremony, acknowledging the contributions of civilian consultants to the war effort. Though many details remained classified, Harold was presented with a Distinguished Civilian Service Medal, one of the highest honors a civilian could receive for contributions to national defense. The citation read in part, "For exceptional technical innovation that significantly enhanced military capabilities during a critical period of national need, and for continued service in adapting such innovation to peaceful purposes in support of American agriculture." As Harold accepted the medal, he reflected on the improbable journey that had begun with a simple desire to help his crops withstand drought. What he had created had served purposes both destructive and constructive, bringing both death and life. "A remarkable journey from a small Alabama farm to this ceremony," the presenting official commented as he shook Harold's hand. Harold smiled thoughtfully. "The most important journeys are the ones that bring us back to where we started, but with new eyes to see it." In the decades that followed, Harold continued farming well into his 70s, eventually passing primary management responsibilities to Thomas. The innovative spirit that had led to his wartime contribution remained evident in his continuous experimentation with agricultural methods, though none ever had quite the unexpected impact of his crazy fertilizer mix. Harold Whitaker passed away in 1978, at the age of 82, widely respected in his community as a successful farmer and agricultural innovator. His obituary in the local newspaper made no mention of Compound W or his wartime service, as those aspects of his life remained classified until 1993, 15 years after his death. When the information was finally declassified, Thomas, by then in his 60s and still operating the family farm, was approached by a military historian researching overlooked contributions to the Allied war effort. "Your father never spoke about this?" the historian asked, surprised that such a significant contribution had remained so completely secret. "He mentioned consulting work for the government during the war," Thomas replied, "but he always said his real work was here, making things grow." The historian nodded, making notes. "By our estimates, ordnance utilizing your father's innovation was responsible for disabling or sinking at least 17 enemy vessels and significantly contributed to numerous land-based operations in the Pacific Theater. Military historians estimate his work may have saved thousands of American lives." Thomas absorbed this information quietly, thinking of the humble man who had spent his life tending crops and soil with the same careful attention he had apparently given to his unexpected wartime creation. "He would have been more proud of the farms his work has helped feed since the war," Thomas said finally. "That was always his true purpose, helping things grow." Today, modern derivatives of Harold's process continue to be used in both agricultural and industrial applications, though few who use these technologies are aware of their unlikely origins in the shed of an Alabama farmer trying to weather a drought during World War II. The military applications of Compound W have been superseded by more advanced explosives, but for a critical period of the war, this accidental discovery helped turn the tide of naval combat in the Pacific. Harold Whitaker's journey from Professor Dirt to classified military consultant and back to farmer again stands as a testament to how ordinary individuals with extraordinary ingenuity can profoundly impact history, often in ways they neither intended nor could have imagined. In the fields once tended by Harold and later by Thomas, crops continue to grow, nourished by the same soil that once inspired an accidental discovery that helped win a war. Perhaps the greatest legacy of Harold's crazy fertilizer is not the ships it helped sink or even the improved agricultural yields it eventually enabled, but the reminder that innovation often comes from unexpected places and that the most meaningful discoveries are those that ultimately serve life rather than destruction. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.